Welcome to Second Take, the show that takes a look at the issues behind the news. ArcelorMittal South Africa has confirmed the wind down of its longs business after protracted talks with government, including on trade policy changes. Terence Creamer joins me to discuss the development in a context where tariffs are back on the global agenda. Hi Terence.
Hi Chanel.
Why did the talks with government fail to yield a solution?
We must realise these talks have really been going on for a number of years, but intensified early this year after ArcelorMittal announced, after about a year of review, that they were going to close Newcastle, and with that the longs operations in Mpumalanga, the old Highveld steel, as well as at Vereeniging. So there was an intensive back and forth, and there were a number of issues on the agenda. We know that energy and logistics are top of mind for ArcelorMittal. Electricity prices are rising very strongly, but they also have Newcastle, which was built around a coking coal resource, requires logistics to work, especially rail, to bring in the iron ore. And we know that Transnet's collapse has had a major impact, plus the rise in tariffs there. So that was on the agenda. But there were also, as you mentioned in your intro, there were these issues around the preferential price system for scrap, as well as the export tax for scrap. That became a major issue of contention around the sort of seeming unlevel playing field between the integrated mill, which is Newcastle, and the so-called mini mills or the electric arc furnace operations, which produce mostly long steel, not only, but long steel using scrap. So these were the issues, and I think on all these points they were difficult, plus an request for additional protection. So they're all difficult industrial policy issues that go back many, many years. And if we look back, really some of these changes, particularly around the scrap policy, were made after ArcelorMittal was in dire straits early on, especially its flats business, and got protection from government and a sort of a quid pro quo. Government said, well, we're going to try and open up the market to competition, and they introduced these scrap policies to do that, and it has been successful. But also we've seen a massive investment from the state-owned Industrial Development Corporation. So it's almost a double benefit. They're getting a scrap benefit plus an investment benefit that have come from the IDC. And it's raised a lot of eyebrows because it is a significant discount to what scrap prices would have been. And it's also in that value chain raised concerns because it affected jobs and it affected the margins of recyclers. So but basically I think it failed because they couldn't really, some of those levers are really outside of the control of, say, the DTIC. You can get a preferential pricing agreement from Eskom, but it's a difficult, long process and you have to justify it. And we know that there's a lot of resistance to adding more negotiating pricing agreements. The logistics thing, it requires a lot of investment by Transnet, and costs have been rising there, so that wasn't easy. And then this industrial trade policy issue was a major area of contention, which I don't think they could agree on.
Would trade policy changes have made a difference? Well,
the sort of indications from ArcelorMittal is definitely. They say that if there was some give on the preferential price system and especially the export tax on scrap, they believe that would have made the cost of production of the electric arc furnaces more realistic, and that in that context the integrated Newcastle mill would have been more relatively competitive. We see that in that space, the longs place, we don't get a lot of imports. We mostly get imports in the flat space, and that possibly is because of the policy that's been implemented, industrial policy, trade policy that's been implemented to basically give that scrap advantage. So it has made them more competitive, even relative to Chinese imports. So there has been some price benefit, but on the range of products that are produced here, it's quite a limited range that is coming out of these electric arc furnaces, and that is really a problem for certain downstream users that use specialty long products that only ArcelorMittal makes. And now, there's a fear that it won't only displace that input could actually displace the final product in certain areas. Especially it's been raised in the whole area of automotive components. So there's a feeling, and there's been also some research by think tanks and economic units that change to the PPS, the preferential price system, and that trade intervention in the form of an export tax, if that had been changed, at least eased, that maybe that would have been enough for ArcelorMittal to carry on operating. But they couldn't reach agreement. It would have been a major change. As I said, if we go back, this industrial and trade policy intervention was made specifically to increase the competitive pressures in what would have otherwise been a very monopolistic environment. In the flat steel, it very much still is, although we see SCOR is now producing some flat steel on the back of electric arc furnace steel making. But generally, we would have one steel maker. And what the idea was to use these levers to get some competition and hopefully reduce prices. And we definitely got the competition. We've seen some price benefit, but there's a lot of questions around the sustainability of these electric arc furnaces if some of these benefits were to be taken away, including the massive investments made by the IDC.
What does this say about the use of trade policy to protect and or grow industries?
The main message is it's not simple. So we're getting the message internationally in the international discussion around trade diplomacy, or the lack of it at the moment, is that this is a simple measure. You just put in tariffs, the country that's exporting pays, and you suddenly have a much better productive economy. And it's not simple. South Africa has probably been overly aggressive in being liberal in its trade policy in the last number of years since democracy, and it has really hurt our productive capacity. We've deindustrialized. We've really deindustrialized, and we are importing a lot of products that we used to make locally. But it was about opening to the real trade winds, or the real cold winds of competition, especially because a lot of these industries were monopoly industries. So that was the view: bring down tariffs. Let's see if these guys can stand on their own 2 feet. Many of them couldn't, and we've closed a lot of capacity, which is devastating, because you want to have this. But on the other hand, your consumer, you pays for this, for those trade policies, and for any protective barriers that are in place. It's ultimately the consumer pays. So we've had a benefit of lower prices on a number of items. So we've always been navigating this. We had a sort of hands-off approach in the early days, and then we started to take industrial policy seriously again when we saw massive deindustrialization taking place, which is still, unfortunately, the trend. We haven't exited that deindustrialization trend. But as you can see, when you try and have a muscular industrial policy, say through a PPS or through an export tax, it has implications. And in this case, we've closed down an operation that employs directly and indirectly 3,500 people, many more in the value chain. It's in a town which is really reliant on that enterprise for a lot of other economic activities, so it's devastating for Newcastle. So these, on one, not simple, it's not a simple decision, and two, there's always consequences, many of which are unintended, and you don't actually see what they are going to do, and we've seen that now, and we've had a live example that I've just spoken through. But we can see as well, with the waxing and waning of the American tariffs, put them in, pull them back, put them in, pull them back twice now. You can see the pain and the consequences that are associated with tariff and trade policy and industrial policy. And you have to be very measured and very deliberate when you do this. Definitely we've had an industrial policy and a trade policy around our automotive industry, without which there would be no automotive industry. And there are those who feel that, we're paying it through too high prices in our cars, for instance. But on the whole, the net analysis has been that it's better to have these industries sustained. That's been sort of overarching decision. And we're looking at putting in industrial policy around renewable energy, trade policy around those components. So we are looking at being more muscular, but we have to know for every action there is a reaction and there's a consequence, and it's not simple.
Thank you. That's the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis. Also, don't forget to listen to the audio version of our Engineering News daily email newsletter.